A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, what commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord. If most of us hear something about or read something about the Trappist monks, the members of the Cistercian order of strict observance, we tend to think about the monks who are at Our Lady of Gethsemane Abbey in Bardstown. But there's a story about another group of Trappists in another place, and that story brings the message of today's gospel to today's world. And the story took place in the nation of Algeria, and it was told in a motion picture that was released in the year 2010 that was entitled Of Gods and Men. And the Trappists that the story tells about are known to the world as the monks of Tiberine. Now, to give some background, Algeria is in the northern part of Africa, and in 1830 it became a French colony. So for years afterward, Frenchmen came to live there. And in 1938, a group of Trappist monks came to a place about 40 miles southwest of Algiers, and they established a monastery in the Atlas Mountains, and they named the monastery the Abbey of Our Lady of the Atlas. And they prayed in community, and they served the people that lived around them. And they became so close to the people that a village grew up around the monastery, and it was the village of Tiberine. And while they didn't make many converts to Christianity, some of the locals actually adopted their beliefs. There was a statue of the Blessed Virgin in front of the abbey, and the people of the village came to believe that they were being protected by her, the Mother of Christ. And as the film opens in the year 1993, there are 9 monks at the abbey, and they're led by their abbot, who is Father Christian. And their most notable member is an 80-year-old physician whose name is Brother Luke, who treats all the ailments and the illnesses of the people that live around the abbey. And the monks and the people of the village are living in harmony. But Algeria itself has changed. In 1962, it became an independent country, and for years it was ruled by a secular socialist government. But in the early 1990s, there was an Islamic party that began to win elections, and the government became afraid that the Islamic party would win control of the government, and then they would just take over and impose Sharia. So the government canceled elections. And an armed uprising arose against the government, and it became known as the Algerian Civil War. And there was a particular Islamic group that had the title of the Armed Islamic Group of Algeria that began to engage in terrorism, to targeting civilians. And in 1994, they hijacked an Air France jet, which led to the deaths of a few people. And then they began to target foreign religious groups. And so a number of religious in Algeria were found brutally murdered. And the monks realized what danger they were in, and so they had to decide what to do. Now, the monks at Tiberine were under the rule of Benedict, which meant that they had all taken a vow of stability. They vowed that they would stay at the abbey. But the vow could be dispensed under extreme circumstances, and certainly being threatened with brutal death at the hands of terrorists was a valid means of dispensation. So the monks felt that they could leave if they really wanted to. But the question arose, should they leave? And to answer that question, they had to think about the great law that we hear about in today's gospel. The Pharisees, the scholars of the written law, came up to Christ and asked him, "Master, what is the greatest of these laws?" And Christ replies, "It's not one of your written laws. The greatest law is that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And the second, which is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so the monks thought about that great law of love, and they thought about the people of the village, and the village itself had come into being because of the love of the monks who had come before them, and it would only continue with their love. And then they thought about the greater love, the love for the God to whom they prayed in community every day. And this is shown very beautifully in the film. And there's a very touching scene of Brother Luke, the physician, touching a painting of Christ carrying his cross and meditating, reminding himself that the law of Christ is also the example of Christ as he went to his passion and death out of love for his Father and love for us. And in the end, the monks decided that they had to stay. And sadly, one night, on the night of March 26, 1996, 7 of the monks were abducted at gunpoint by Islamic terrorists. There were 2 of the monks who were sleeping in a different part of the monastery, and they weren't taken, but the 7 monks were taken away, and they were held for exchange for Islamic terrorists that the government held prisoner. But the negotiations didn't go anywhere, and 2 months later, the monks were discovered, and they had been beheaded. And so they were returned, and they were buried at the monastery, and the other 2 monks were reassigned, and the monastery was left abandoned. But that's not the end of the story. Afterward, the heroism, the love of the monks, that story was told from person to person, and then in writing, and eventually the film was released, and people from all around wanted to visit this place, this monastery where the monks gave their lives. And so people from the village and members of religious groups restored the monastery, and today visitors come from all over the world to visit the monastery, and in doing so they support the village. And so you could say, even in their death, the monks of Tiberine give life to the village and to the people that they loved. And today, this great law, the law of love, comes to us. And so we can ask ourselves, what makes us do the things we do, not do the things we don't do? And of course, all of us try to be obedient to the written laws, the laws of our land, the laws of our church, but there's so many things that we don't have a written law for. How often do we visit the sick? How much of our time, our talent, our treasure do we give to others? And even this coming week, do we attend the Eucharistic liturgy on the solemnity of All Saints, even when it's not a holy day of obligation? And for those things, we are bound not by a particular written law, but that law of love that Christ holds us to today. And sometimes following that great law is easy, and sometimes, like it was with the monks, it's very, very difficult. But when it's hard, I can remind myself of that scene of Brother Luke touching the painting of Christ carrying the cross. And I can remind myself that to obey that great law of love is to imitate Christ. And like the monks, just as we share in the mission of Christ to bring life to the world, that one day we may also share in His resurrection to eternal life.
Qui souhaite rester?